Just a quick note before we get started. Something seems to have happened to the video that goes with all of the ongoing discussion, so I'll stick you in some pictures to accompany the discussion. Hello, this is a quick video, hopefully it'll be quick, in which I'm going to explain the proposal to shift the first term of criminology assessment to ungraded assessment. I did this as a video because I thought it would possibly be easier to digest than sending you around a document, and you could listen to it anytime you like, and you could stick me on double speed if you wanted to. Alright, so let's start with the beginning. What's the problem? We are facing rates of anxiety amongst our students that are unprecedented. It's been referred to in some of the research as an epidemic of anxiety. Our students are starting their studies feeling overwhelmed, and this has a pretty significant impact on performance and on attrition. It also leads to risk aversion, which is pretty bad for learning, but ironically can also lead to students engaging in higher risk behaviours as a way of avoiding the risk of submitting assessment and failing. So it leads to cheating, and we've also seen, I think, an increase in use of AI to write assignments. We have no proof, but the method of writing many students are using is very similar to AI writing, and in any case it's still not passing work. Either way, it's still not really of an appropriate standard. So part of the problem with this anxiety, and therefore in terms of the institution bottom line attrition, is the lack of cultural capital among students in terms of university study, particularly in the traditional CQU audience. And that puts more and more importance on the transition to university, and more pressure. I know we're doing work around onboarding and so on, but when you think about it, the best onboarding in the world, you still then only have a month or so till students have to start submitting assessment. And that's a very short time to try and prepare them for a task that they seem quite unprepared for. What is the concept? What is this ungraded concept? Well, the idea is that the first part of a student's study, often a first year, although we're being very cautious and just going to try for a first term before we can appraise the success, that gives students a period to adjust and to learn the ropes as far as university goes. Now, this is not uncommon. In the United Kingdom, for instance, most universities, the first year units do not contribute to the student's GPA. So they are effectively, at the end of the day, ungraded. They get assigned a grade, but that grade is theoretical. It doesn't mean anything in terms of the student's GPA. A lot of colleges, universities in the United States have moved to ungraded. A lot of medical schools have moved to ungraded because of the problems of suicide that comes out of the competitiveness of medical students. And also some of the elite law schools have done the same. So ungrading is not just an approach for students who are struggling or students who come from a background where they're not prepared for study. It's also being used across the board as a better alternative, a different approach to use of grades. What do you do instead, I guess, is the next question. Is first of all, you move towards a competency-based structure of learning, where you're very clear at what the students are expected to be able to do, and not in terms of setting them up a rubric and setting an assignment with a rubric, but really breaking down those tasks into those competencies. And we are fortunate that we have an offer of assistance from our TAFE colleagues who already assess in that sort of way, to use that competency-based assessment as a bridge from where the students are now to the way where we want them to be before we start grading them. The other thing about competency-based assessment is that learners can resubmit until they get it right, and which might at first raise alarms. That's going to be more marking. It's going to increase costs, and it's going to increase marking time for individual lecturers. But at the end of the day, it doesn't, because your competencies are framed so specifically. It's a different sort of marking task. And research into marking in any case has suggested that most markers spend a lot more time justifying the grade they give than they do giving feedback to students. And that was a bit of an eye-opener for me, because I looked at my own practice and realised, yeah, that's probably true. You do spend a lot more time justifying why something is a credit rather than a distinction, and focusing on that rather than necessarily what students need to learn to improve. So there is a structure for replacing graded learning with ungraded learning using the competency structure. It's also can be enhanced with lots of other techniques, like really working towards student portfolios, which are a much clearer course towards employability than grades. Great many employers have announced a skepticism around grades. They don't believe they mean very much, whereas a portfolio of work is much, much more meaningful. And you can do other things, interesting things in combination of ungraded work. I mean, it's not just a case of a pass-fail. There's still an opportunity for substantive feedback and opportunity to integrate interesting things like setting the students in a competency-based assessment, giving them feedback on what would be expected if were this a graded assessment, and then asking them to assess themselves, and then entering that process of discourse and discussion around, well, what are the expectations going to be when they move on to graded study? So there's lots of opportunities there. It's not just a case of saying, oh, we just put off marking and we do the pass-fail for 6 months or 12 months if it's successful. There is a whole lot of structured practice. There's a whole history of pedagogical research around this that supports it. So what are the pros and cons of this? And I guess that gets into that question of, well, why do we grade in the first place? And there's an excellent book written on the subject. I'll put the full reference up on the screen, called Punished by Rewards by Alfie Kohn. And it's basically it's a summary of all the research into motivation and learning based on the behaviourist idea of punishments and rewards, giving grades as a form of like giving the pigeon the pellet to motivate, or the electric shock to motivate certain forms of behaviour. That book was written in 93, quite a long while ago, and I've got the 25th anniversary edition. So it's been updated in the meantime, including some fairly lengthy responses to the critics of the first edition, and it's definitely a good read, particularly for those like myself who'd never really thought about what we do when it comes to grading and what grading practice means. And it's full of surprises, including the fact that grading only really became widespread practice in the 1940s. It's not really that old. And we're not really certain about where grading came from. It has a very murky history. But the best we can tell is it was introduced by American Ivy League colleges as a way of encouraging competition among students. Now, think of what you might about competition, but it's that competition that's driving a lot of the stress levels and the anxiety among students as well. And if you are in a position where you think, well, I still want to have competition amongst the top students, you can still use student prizes and those sort of things to try and to continue that process of competition amongst that echelon of students without implying the negative effects of grading to everyone else. So there's been, since the introduction of grading, since the early introduction in the 40s, there's been a long history of research in scientific research attempting to explain how grading leads to better motivation and performance, which quickly turned around to showing how it actually had the opposite effect. There are pretty much all of the research has shown that grading reduces performance, increases anxiety, leads to students performing in perverse strategies, as I said before, around cheating and so on. And it just doesn't act as a motivator. Rewards, or in behaviourist language, extrinsic motivations, not only are not only better than intrinsic rewards, but they actually destroy intrinsic rewards. There's plenty of rather scary research where children were paid to do something they enjoyed, like painting, and they quickly found that not only did the payment not increase their performance as painting, but it swiftly reduced their enjoyment of and willingness to paint unless they were being paid to do it. So anyway, it's not the time or space to go through all that research. Suffice to say that the idea of grading comes out of a different era. It comes out of this idea of being able to provide some kind of scientific, empirical basis for the assessment process, which would then motivate students to work better because they want the higher grades. So there's been proof that doesn't happen. It actually reduces students' performance. And also that attempts to be more and more objective have never succeeded either. That assessment is fundamentally a matter of judgment. It's a subjective relationship between assessor and student. And the more we pretend that there's some kind of scientific, empirical basis to what we're doing when we grade students, the more we're deceiving them and possibly deceiving ourselves along the way. And again, there's a research basis for this. This isn't just Cone saying this. It's not just me saying this. There's been a lot of scientific research into grading and rubrics and everything else, where it's been pretty much proven that they are not a reliable predictor. That basically assessment is about the innate human quality of judgment. It can never be done in an entirely objective way. So coming back to, why do we grade? The usual justifications that we give for grading are two. One is that it's an incentive, that students will be more motivated, will do better work if incented by grades. And I think at this point we've pretty safely got evidence that that's not the case. The other one is that grading is an easier way of ranking students, particularly for the purposes of admission to higher degrees or for employers. Now, there are a few critiques of that point of view as well. Educational purists have raised, and I think they've got a good point of, is, well, who said our job in teaching was to provide a ranking for employers? Surely that's what the employers should be doing. And I think there's an idealistic, but a certain point in that. The other is that grading can be replaced by things like portfolios, and have been in colleges that have gone completely ungraded. They have not prevented students from getting work or getting employment or higher degrees. That being said, we're not talking about going completely ungraded in criminology. We're really only talking at this point about the first term. And then if it's successful, then maybe we'll look at the first year, bringing this into line in the way that the UK does things. And, the UK educational system doesn't seem to have fallen apart yet. Singapore, interestingly, the high school program has gone completely ungraded, but that's a completely different issue. So, all right, this will mean reasonably quick action from us to try and get the changes through for next year, for that first 4 units to be turned from current graded units to ungraded units. I'm not sure what that will involve, or whether there'll be opposition from curriculum committee. So I guess I need to move on that as soon as possible, as soon as I get a sense of the approval from the community and from relevant people who I'm sending this video to this approach. In terms of a summary of what the impact will be, first of all, will it have an impact on students' engagement and motivation? We know that it won't decrease motivation. okay. We're not sure. There's no clear evidence that anything increases motivation all that well, but we know that grading significantly decreases performance and motivation. And it's hoped that providing a different form of feedback and a direct feedback on learning and using the competency-driven assessment will actually further motivate students, because that will build their intrinsic motivation to succeed. We hope that it'll reduce risk-averse behaviour, because students will not feel pressured to cheat or to use AI or any of those other things in order to get assessment in, because there is less risk. I mean, there will obviously be a limit to how many times they can resubmit, but it will allow them at least that safety margin going forward. It's also, from the people who've reported on moving to ungraded models, improves the relationship between academic staff and students, because it moves to a less adversarial model and actually leads to a stronger student community, student bond. Okay, so where we stand is, and I realise this is up to 16 minutes, it's a longer video than I thought I was going to make, but then again, you can't shut me up when I start talking. But where we're at is looking at converting those first 4 units in the criminology degree to pass-fail units, but not just simply taking grading out. We're looking at replacing it with a competency-based infrastructure, with stronger assessment that's built around feedback, that will build those core skills, that will turn those students who lack the cultural capital, who are passive learners, who don't have a sense of autonomy as learners, it'll give us an envelope to try and turn that around. Of course, it won't work for everyone. We'll still have students who want to be spoon-fed and so on. But it's a worthwhile experiment that really, as far as I can see, doesn't have significant dangers involved. And if it does, if we find that students are even less motivated than they are now, then we can change back to the old system. We'll only have 1 term of this in operation, but given, us and every other university in the world is already struggling with student engagement. It's already struggling with particularly that level of student anxiety and that paralysis students have about getting started with their study for fear of failure, then I think this is a approach which may promise to have at least some positive impacts. And, if we don't try, we won't find out. So please, if you have opinions on this, strong, indifferent, otherwise, please send me an email and let me know what you think, and I'll keep you in the loop to the next stage of development.